He thought she was just a waitress, but in less than 10 seconds, she would decide whether he walked out alive or never understood why he didn't. The glass in Adrian Volkov's hand never trembled, not even as the low amber light of the restaurant reflected off its surface like liquid gold, not even as laughter circled the table where powerful men discussed deals measured in millions and silence carried more weight than words, not even as the woman approached from behind him with nothing but a tray, a paper straw wrapper, and a choice that could shatter everything. Lena Brooks kept her eyes down the way she had been trained by life itself, not by any school or system but by years of learning that invisibility was safety, that being overlooked was survival, that people like Adrian never saw people like her unless something had already gone wrong. The manager's voice still echoed in her head from earlier that night, sharp and dismissive, reminding her that she was replaceable, that she should move faster, smile wider, speak less, exist only as long as she was useful. She had nodded then, just like she always did, because arguing never paid rent and dignity didn't tip 20%. But now, standing just 3 feet behind one of the most powerful men in the city, Lena wasn't thinking about rent or tips or even the job she might lose in the next 60 seconds. She was watching patterns, small ones, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for them. The way the man to Adrian's right shifted his stance half a second too late whenever someone moved. The way his eyes scanned not just the room but the exits, the ceiling, the reflections and the polished silverware. The way his earpiece didn't quite match the others, the wire just slightly off, like it had been placed by someone who had seen it before but never worn it. Lena had seen that before. Years ago. In a life she never talked about. In a moment that had cost someone everything because no one spoke up in time. Her fingers tightened around the thin paper wrapper as she stepped forward, her movements smooth, practiced, invisible to everyone except the one person who suddenly mattered most. Adrian didn't look at her when she set the glass down, didn't acknowledge her presence the way powerful men rarely did, but his awareness was something else entirely, something quiet and precise, like a blade resting in its sheath. Lena didn't speak. She couldn't. Words would draw attention, and attention would end this before it even began. Instead, she let the wrapper slip beneath the base of his glass, her hand steady despite the storm building in her chest, her eyes fixed on the table as if nothing had changed. For a moment, nothing did. The conversation continued, the laughter rolled, the illusion of control remained perfectly intact. Then Adrian's fingers paused. Just for a fraction of a second. Just long enough to feel something that shouldn't be there. He lifted the glass, saw the paper, and unfolded it without shifting his expression, without breaking the rhythm of the room, without giving away the fact that everything had just changed. Your bodyguard isn't one of yours. The word sat between them like a secret too heavy to ignore. Adrian didn't react. Not outwardly. But something behind his eyes sharpened, recalibrated, as if the entire room had just been redrawn in his mind. And for the first time since she stepped into that restaurant, Lena allowed herself a single, controlled breath. Because now it wasn't just her decision anymore. It was his. Adrian did not look up from the table, but the air around him shifted in a way that only men trained to read danger would notice, subtle, precise, like a current changing direction beneath still water, and the men seated with him continued speaking, unaware that the conversation they believed they controlled had already become something else entirely, something quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous than raised voices or visible threats. He folded the paper once, then again, his movements unhurried, deliberate, as if the message carried no more weight than a receipt, and yet his mind had already begun dissecting every variable in the room, every face, every position, every breath. The bodyguard to his right remained still, disciplined, almost perfectly aligned with the others, but almost was a detail Adrian had built an empire on. Never ignoring, because perfection was learned, but instinct revealed truth. He reached for his glass again, not to drink, but to use the reflection along its curved surface, a distorted mirror that showed him what direct vision would expose, and there it was, just for a fraction of a second, a hesitation in the man's posture when one of the waitstaff passed behind him, a delay too small for anyone untrained to notice, but not for Adrian, not anymore. Across the table, one of his associates laughed, making a comment about expansion and timing, but Adrian only nodded faintly, his attention now split between the illusion of normalcy and the quiet unraveling of it beneath the surface. He adjusted his cuff, a signal so subtle it could have been mistaken for habit, and within seconds, another of his men shifted position near the edge of the room, not approaching, not confronting, simply observing from a new angle, testing the space without announcing the test. Lena had already stepped away by then, her tray balanced carefully in her hand as she moved through the room with practiced invisibility, but her heartbeat had not slowed, not even slightly, because she knew this part was no longer hers to control, and yet she could not stop watching, not directly, but through reflections, through timing, through the same language of small details that had brought her to act in the first place. The manager called her name from across the room, irritation sharp in his voice, reminding her to clear table 12, to stop drifting, to do her job, and she nodded again, just like before, just like always, but this time there was something steadier in her movement, something grounded in the knowledge that what she had seen was real, and that someone else now saw it too. Back at the table, Adrian leaned slightly to the left, engaging in conversation while subtly shifting his line of sight, allowing the suspected bodyguard to move within a different frame, a different angle, and again, there it was, not a mistake, not chance, but a pattern, the kind that revealed itself only when pressure was applied without being seen. The man's gaze flicked once toward the exit, then toward the mirrored column near the bar, calculating, measuring, waiting, and Adrian felt the confirmation settle into place without a single word needing to be spoken. He set the glass down gently, the soft sound barely audible against the low hum of the restaurant, but for him, it marked the moment everything changed from suspicion to certainty. And yet, he did not act. Not openly. Not yet. Because power was not proven by reaction, but by control, and right now, control meant silence. Across the room, Lena paused for half a second beside an empty table, her fingers tightening around the edge of her tray before releasing again, her face calm, her posture composed, but her eyes, steady and unblinking, carried the weight of a truth she had chosen not to ignore. And in that moment, without a single glance exchanged, both of them understood the same thing. The room had not changed. But everything inside it had. Adrian let the conversation continue as if nothing had shifted, his voice calm, measured, responding at exactly the right moments, but beneath that controlled exterior his mind was already 3 steps ahead, mapping outcomes, calculating intent, and testing the invisible line between instinct and confirmation, because instinct had kept him alive, but confirmation was what allowed him to stay in control. He leaned back slightly in his chair, creating space without signaling discomfort, and as he did, he reached for the folded napkin beside his plate, not to use it, but to reposition it just enough to alter the reflection from the polished surface of the table, turning an ordinary object into another angle of observation, another quiet advantage. The man to his right did not notice, or if he did, he gave no sign, but that was the problem, the precision was too careful, too studied, like someone performing a role instead of living it. Across the room, Lena moved from table to table with the same steady rhythm, refilling glasses, clearing plates, answering brief requests with polite nods, but her awareness never left the corner where Adrian sat, not directly, never obviously, but through fragments, through timing, through the subtle shifts in the room that most people never learn to read. She saw the way one of Adrian's real men adjusted his stance closer to the column near the bar, not aggressively, not urgently, just enough to create a better line of sight, and she knew then that Adrian had understood, that her message had not been dismissed as paranoia or ignored as interference. The manager passed by her again, his expression tight with impatience, reminding her under his breath to stay focused, to stop lingering, to remember her place, and she lowered her eyes just enough to satisfy him, just enough to maintain the illusion that she was exactly what everyone believed she was, someone small, someone unimportant, someone who did not belong in decisions that carried weight. But inside, her thoughts were steady, anchored in something older than fear, something shaped by memory. Years ago, she had watched someone hesitate, watched someone second-guess what they knew was wrong, and that hesitation had cost more than anyone was willing to admit afterward. Silence had been easier then. Safer. But it had not been right. Back at the table, Adrian shifted his attention fully to the man beside him for the first time, not confronting, not accusing, simply including him more directly in the conversation, asking a question about timing, about coordination, about details that required instinctive answers, not rehearsed ones. The man responded smoothly, almost perfectly, but there it was again, that fraction of a pause before speaking, that brief recalibration as if he were selecting the correct answer rather than knowing it. Adrian nodded once, as if satisfied, but inside the conclusion had already formed, solid and undeniable. He reached for his glass again, this time taking a slow sip, allowing the moment to stretch, allowing the room to settle into the illusion that everything was exactly as it had been minutes ago, because the most effective control was the kind no one recognized until it was too late to question. Lena stopped briefly at the service station, setting down her tray, her fingers brushing against the edge of the counter as she steadied herself, not from fear, but from the weight of what came next, because she understood that recognizing danger was only the beginning, and that what followed depended entirely on how those with power chose to respond. She did not look toward Adrian again, not once, but she felt the shift in the room, subtle, controlled, undeniable, like the moment before a storm changes direction. And in that quiet, unspoken alignment, the truth settled fully into place. The man standing beside Adrian did not belong there. And now, Adrian knew it too. Adrian placed the glass back onto the table with the same quiet precision he had used all evening, but now every movement carried intention, every second stretched just enough to allow the pieces to align exactly where he wanted them, because reacting too quickly would reveal awareness, and revealing awareness would collapse the advantage he had just been given. He shifted his attention back to the conversation, asking another question, this time directing it not at the man beside him but at someone across the table, creating a natural turn in the flow, a reason for every head to angle slightly away, a subtle redistribution of attention that most would never notice but that opened a narrow window of observation exactly where he needed it. In that window, the man to his right adjusted his stance again, just a fraction, his weight shifting toward his back foot, his gaze flicking once more toward the exit before returning to neutral, and Adrian saw it clearly now, not as a suspicion, not as a pattern, but as a certainty that settled into his mind with absolute clarity. He did not belong. Across the room, Lena picked up another tray, her movement smooth, controlled, but her awareness sharpened by the silence that had formed beneath the surface of everything, because she could feel it now, the difference between a room that was simply busy and a room that was being quietly controlled by someone who understood every angle of it. She moved past table 14, past a couple speaking in low voices, past a man checking his phone, all of them unaware that something had already shifted, that the balance of the room had tilted without a sound. The manager glanced at her again but said nothing this time, perhaps sensing that something in the atmosphere had changed, something he could not name but did not want to interfere with. Back at the table, Adrian adjusted his watch, the motion small, almost absent-minded, but it was not for time, it was for signal, and within seconds, one of his trusted men near the bar took a slow step forward, not closing distance, not confronting, simply narrowing the space in a way that would limit movement without drawing attention. Another shifted near the hallway leading to the restrooms, creating a second boundary, equally subtle, equally controlled. The man beside Adrian remained composed, his posture steady, his expression neutral, but the precision of his stillness now worked against him, because it was too consistent, too deliberate, like someone maintaining a role under pressure rather than existing naturally within it. Adrian leaned slightly toward him then, as if sharing a passing comment, his voice low, calm, carrying no edge of accusation, and for a moment, the man responded as expected, nodding, answering, maintaining the illusion. But there it was again, that fraction of delay, that invisible calculation before speaking, and Adrian knew the line had already been crossed, not in action, but in truth. Lena paused briefly at the edge of the service station, her hand resting lightly against the counter, her breathing steady, because she understood what came next did not require noise, did not require confrontation, only precision, only control. She had seen this kind of moment once before, long ago, when someone had chosen to act quietly instead of loudly, and it had changed everything without a single raised voice. She did not look toward Adrian, not even once, but she felt the shift complete itself, like a lock turning into place. Back at the table, Adrian straightened slightly, his expression unchanged, his presence as composed as ever, but the decision had already been made, not to expose, not to accuse, but to remove uncertainty with the same silence it had entered the room. The conversation continued, the glasses clinked softly, the low hum of the restaurant carried on as if nothing had changed, but within that ordinary rhythm, a new order had already taken hold, one that no one else could see, one that did not need to be announced. And in that quiet control, the truth no longer waited to be discovered. It had already been decided. Adrian allowed the silence beneath the noise to settle fully before he made his next move, because timing was not about speed but about inevitability, and once something became inevitable, it no longer required force, only direction. He reached for the bottle at the center of the table and poured a small amount into his glass, his hand steady, his expression unchanged, as if the evening had not shifted at all, as if every man seated with him still belonged exactly where they were. Then he spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a calm authority that redirected the conversation without resistance, suggesting a brief change of setting, a more private space for the next part of their discussion, a logical progression that no one questioned because it sounded natural, because it fit the rhythm of power they were used to following. Around the table, chairs moved slightly, glasses were set down, agreements were murmured, and in that simple transition, Adrian created the one thing he needed most, movement. The man to his right responded as expected, stepping into position with the others, adjusting his distance, aligning himself with the group, but movement revealed what stillness could hide, and Adrian watched closely as that same fraction of delay appeared again, that same subtle recalibration as if the man were tracking something internal rather than responding instinctively to the flow around him. Across the room, Lena noticed it too, not because she was looking directly, but because she understood how patterns changed when pressure was introduced, how small inconsistencies became visible only when everything else remained smooth. She moved toward the service station again, her tray empty now, her hand steady as she set it down, but her attention fixed on the shifting rhythm of the room, on the way Adrian's men adjusted without speaking, on the way space was quietly being shaped around one person who did not realize he was already contained within it. The manager passed behind her, starting to speak, then stopping mid-sentence as if sensing that something invisible but important was unfolding, something that made interruption feel like a mistake. Back near the table, Adrian stood, buttoning his jacket with a slow, deliberate motion, his posture relaxed, his gaze neutral, but his awareness fully engaged, tracking every angle, every step, every reflection in the polished surfaces around him. He gestured lightly toward the hallway leading to the private dining area, allowing the others to move first, creating a natural order that positioned the man beside him exactly where he needed him, not at the front, not at the back, but in the middle, where observation was easiest and control required the least effort. As they began to walk, the room did not react, the low hum of conversation continued, glasses clinked, servers moved, and to anyone watching, it was just another group of powerful men transitioning to a more secluded space. But Lena felt the difference as clearly as if the air itself had shifted temperature, because she knew what it meant when control became quiet instead of visible. She took a step forward, then stopped, her fingers brushing the edge of the counter, her breathing even, because this was the moment where outcomes were decided without announcement. Adrian walked beside the man now, close enough to observe without intruding, close enough to confirm without exposing, and as they reached the threshold of the hallway, he spoke again, a simple question about logistics, about timing, about something that required an immediate, instinctive response. The man answered, but the delay was there again, unmistakable now, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but calculation, and Adrian felt the final piece fall into place with quiet certainty. He did not stop walking. He did not change pace. But everything around that man had already changed. Behind them, Lena exhaled slowly, her gaze lowering once more, her posture returning to what the world expected to see, but inside, she knew the truth had already done its work. No one had raised their voice. No one had made a scene. And yet, nothing about that room would be the same again. The hallway leading to the private dining area was quieter, the kind of quiet that did not come from absence of sound but from control, from design, from the understanding that what happened there was meant to remain contained, and Adrian stepped into that space without hesitation, his pace unchanged, his presence steady, as if he had walked that path 1,000 times without ever encountering anything unexpected. The men followed naturally, their movements aligned, their positions shifting into a familiar formation that required no instruction, and at the center of that formation, the man who did not belong continued to move with them, matching their rhythm just closely enough to avoid attention, but not closely enough to escape it. Adrian stopped near the entrance of the private room, turning slightly as if to allow the others to enter first, a gesture of leadership that appeared courteous but was in fact deliberate, because positioning was everything, and where a man stood often revealed more than what he said. One by one, the others stepped inside, taking their places around the table, adjusting their jackets, their watches, their posture, settling into the next phase of the evening without question. The man followed, pausing for just a fraction of a second at the threshold, his eyes scanning the room in a way that might have seemed routine to anyone else, but to Adrian, it confirmed everything. He was measuring exits. He was mapping space. He was not part of the system. Adrian entered last, closing the door behind him with a soft, controlled motion, the sound barely audible but final in its implication, and for a brief moment, the room held a stillness that felt heavier than the conversation that would follow. Across the table, one of the men began speaking again, continuing where they had left off, discussing timelines, projections, logistics, but Adrian did not immediately respond. Instead, he moved toward his chair, his gaze passing over each person in the room, not lingering, not focusing, but taking in everything at once, the way he always did when something required absolute clarity. He sat down slowly, placing his hands on the table, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, and then he spoke, not to the group, but to the man who had followed him inside. It was a simple question, phrased as casually as any other, something about a detail from earlier in the evening, something that required familiarity, not preparation. The man answered, his voice steady, his tone controlled, but the delay was there again, subtle, precise, undeniable. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for Adrian to decide. No one else reacted. No one else needed to. Because Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He did not create a scene. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the edge of the table, a sound so soft it might have gone unnoticed, but within seconds, the space around the man changed. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But enough. One of Adrian's men shifted his chair just slightly closer. Another adjusted his position near the door. A third stood from where he had been leaning against the wall, moving just enough to alter the balance of the room. There was no confrontation. No sudden movement. Only a quiet tightening of control that left no space for uncertainty. The man remained still, his expression unchanged, but for the first time since entering the restaurant, something in his posture shifted, not visibly to others, but enough for Adrian to see it clearly. Awareness. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness that something had changed. Adrian watched him for a moment longer, then looked away, returning his attention to the table, to the conversation, to the illusion that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. And in that moment, the decision was complete. The truth had been identified. The control had been established. And whatever came next would not require force. Because in that room, silence had already done all the work. Adrian let the conversation carry forward for several more minutes, allowing the rhythm of business to mask the quiet shift that had already taken place, because the most effective control was the kind that felt like nothing at all, the kind that allowed everyone in the room to believe they were still exactly where they intended to be. He listened as one of his associates outlined projections for the next quarter, numbers spoken with confidence, strategies layered with ambition, but Adrian's attention was no longer on the words themselves, it was on the space between them, on the subtle changes in posture, in breath, in awareness, especially from the man who had now begun to understand that something was no longer aligned. It was not panic. It was not fear. It was the first realization that the environment he thought he had mapped was no longer predictable. Adrian reached for a folder placed neatly beside him, opening it with calm precision, revealing documents that had been prepared in advance, though not for the reason anyone else assumed. He slid one page forward across the table, directing attention away from himself, allowing the group to lean in, to focus, to engage, and in doing so, he created another shift in positioning, another subtle narrowing of space around the man who did not belong. The others adjusted naturally, chairs moving an inch closer, elbows resting on the table, bodies angling toward the documents, and in that movement, the man found himself slightly offset, not excluded, but no longer perfectly integrated. Lena, still outside in the main dining area, felt the absence of Adrian's presence like a change in gravity, the room lighter but less anchored, and yet her attention remained fixed on the closed hallway door, because she knew that whatever had begun there had not ended, it had only moved somewhere quieter. She continued her work, clearing a table, replacing silverware, responding to a customer with a polite smile, but her mind replayed the details she had noticed earlier, reinforcing them, confirming them, reminding herself that what she had seen was not imagination, not coincidence, but recognition. Inside the private room, Adrian closed the folder slowly, his fingers resting on the edge of the table as he leaned back slightly, his gaze sweeping the room once more before settling, briefly, on the man beside him. It was not a stare. It was not a challenge. It was a moment of acknowledgement, subtle but deliberate, and in that moment, the man's composure held. But only enough to maintain the illusion for anyone who was not looking closely. Adrian spoke again, his tone even, controlled, suggesting a minor adjustment to their plans, something small, something reasonable, something that required agreement, and as the others responded, nodding, adding their input, the man hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before aligning with the consensus. That hesitation was the final confirmation. Adrian nodded once, as if satisfied, and then he did something that changed the entire dynamic without altering a single visible detail. He stood. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just enough to signal a transition, a pause, a moment to reset before continuing. The others followed instinctively, chairs shifting back, jackets straightened, the natural flow of movement re-established. But this time, as they repositioned, the space around the man tightened further, not visibly, not obviously, but enough that his options narrowed, enough that his freedom of movement became a controlled variable rather than an assumption. Adrian walked toward the far side of the room, his steps measured, his posture relaxed, and as he passed the man, he spoke quietly, a single sentence, calm, precise, carrying no accusation, only clarity. The man did not respond immediately. He did not need to. Because in that moment, he understood. Not everything. Not how. Not why. But enough. Adrian continued walking, not looking back, not waiting for a reaction, because the outcome no longer depended on what the man chose to do. It had already been decided. And in that room, where no voice had been raised and no scene had been made, the truth had settled into place with a finality that required no explanation. The room did not erupt, it did not fracture, it simply recalibrated, as if an invisible hand had adjusted the weight of every person inside it, and Adrian stood at the far side of the table, his back partially turned, giving the illusion of distance while maintaining complete control over every angle that mattered. The man remained where he was, not restrained, not confronted, but no longer free in the way he had been minutes before, because freedom in that room had never been about space, it had always been about permission, and that permission had already been withdrawn. One of Adrian's men shifted slightly closer to the door, another adjusted his position near the wall, their movements quiet, unremarkable, but deliberate enough to redefine the boundaries without ever announcing them. The others at the table continued speaking in low, measured tones, discussing figures, timelines, details that now served a different purpose, not just business, but structure, maintaining the normalcy that allowed everything else to happen without disruption. Adrian turned back slowly, his gaze settling on the man once more, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity, the kind that did not need to be spoken to be understood. For a brief moment, the man held that gaze, his expression composed, controlled, but beneath that control, something had shifted, not outwardly, but internally, the realization that whatever role he had been playing had reached its limit. Adrian took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to remove any illusion of uncertainty, and then he spoke again, his voice low, even, carrying no threat, only finality, and the room seemed to quiet around those words, not because they were loud, but because they did not need to be. The man exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, not surrender, not resistance, but acknowledgement, the kind that comes when the outcome is no longer a question but a fact. He did not argue. He did not attempt to explain. Because in that space, explanations were unnecessary, and arguments held no value once the truth had been recognized. Adrian nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and in that gesture, everything was decided. There was no escalation, no sudden movement, no visible shift that would alarm anyone outside the room, only a quiet understanding that the situation had reached its conclusion. The men around the table adjusted once more, not closing in, not reacting, simply maintaining the structure that had already been established, ensuring that nothing about the moment broke the calm that defined it. Adrian stepped back slightly, reclaiming his position. At the table, his posture returning to its earlier ease, as if the entire sequence had been nothing more than a brief interruption in an otherwise ordinary evening. He reached for the folder again, opening it with the same measured precision, and resumed the conversation as if nothing had changed, because outwardly, nothing had. But inside that room, the balance had shifted completely. Outside, Lena stood near the service station, her hands resting lightly against the counter, her gaze lowered, her expression calm, but she felt it, the quiet resolution that traveled through the space without a sound, the kind of resolution that did not need to be witnessed to be real. She did not look toward the hallway. She did not need to. Because she already knew how it would end. Not with noise. Not with chaos. But with silence. And in that silence, the truth would remain exactly where it belonged. The door to the private room opened again with the same quiet precision it had closed, and Adrian stepped out first, his posture unchanged, his expression composed, as if the past several minutes had been nothing more than routine, nothing more than another layer of control added to an evening already defined by it. The men followed behind him in measured sequence, their positions naturally resetting as they re-entered the main dining area, blending seamlessly back into the rhythm of the restaurant, where nothing had stopped, nothing had paused, and no one had noticed the shift that had just taken place beyond those walls. The man who did not belong was no longer among them, not removed with spectacle, not exposed with noise, but simply absent, as if he had never been part of the structure to begin with, as if the room itself had corrected an imbalance without needing acknowledgement. Conversations resumed at nearby tables, glasses caught the warm light again, servers moved with quiet efficiency, and the world outside that private space continued exactly as it had before, unaware that anything had changed at all. Lena stood near the edge of the service station, her hands steady now, her breathing even, but her awareness sharpened by the return of Adrian's presence into the room. Because she could feel the difference immediately, the way the space settled again around him, the way control re-established itself without effort, without announcement. She did not look directly at him at first, keeping her movements aligned with expectation, clearing a table, adjusting a setting, maintaining the role she had always played, but something within her had shifted, not outwardly, not visibly, but in the quiet understanding that what she had done had mattered, that what she had seen had not been dismissed or ignored. Adrian paused briefly near the main table, exchanging a few words with one of his associates, his voice calm, his tone unchanged, but then, almost as if guided by something deeper than routine, his gaze moved across the room and found her. It was not immediate. It was not obvious. But it was precise. For a brief moment, the distance between them closed without a single step being taken, without a single word being spoken, and in that moment, Lena did not look away. She held his gaze, steady, composed, not challenging, not seeking approval, but simply present, as someone who understood exactly what had passed between them without needing it explained. Adrian studied her for a second longer, not with suspicion, not with curiosity alone, but with recognition, the kind that acknowledged not just what she had done, but what it required to do it. Then he gave the smallest nod, a gesture so subtle that no one else in the room would have noticed it, but for Lena, it carried the weight of everything that had just occurred. She returned the nod just as slightly, her expression unchanged, her posture composed, and then she turned away, picking up her tray, stepping back into the flow of the room as if nothing had happened, as if she were exactly who everyone believed her to be. Adrian watched her for a moment longer before shifting his attention back to the evening, to the conversations, to the structure he maintained so effortlessly, but something in his gaze had changed, something quieter, something deeper, as if a new variable had entered a world that rarely allowed for unpredictability. The room continued. The night moved forward. And no one spoke of what had happened, because it did not need to be spoken. In that silence, something had been revealed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with absolute clarity. And that day, without a single word, the world remembered what dignity looks like.